I'm Chris Boyd. Up next on Think, our strangely incomplete vision of what America stands for. We'll spend this hour with writer Mychal Denzel Smith, who notes that our self-image proudly claims freedom as an American value, but disavows centuries of enslavement, and uses the criminal legal system to banish people who do bad things, but fails to confront the societal conditions that give rise to crime. Smith doesn't support President Trump, but he now realizes his 2016 election was probably inevitable. And Smith is not convinced that electing a new president will really fix what ails this country. Our conversation starts after a short break.
Funding for the Think podcast comes from the UT Dallas Jindal School of Management Global Leadership MBA, ranked number 1 for Best Online MBA by CEO Magazine. Spring 2021 semester applications are open. Details at glemba.utdallas.edu. Funding for Think comes from the University of Texas at Dallas, celebrating 50 years and ranked first among Texas public universities for value by Forbes. More information at utdallas.edu/bright. UT Dallas, moving at the speed of bright.
If you want to define the United States, you'd better be prepared to cherry pick, starting with the fact that we call ourselves America as if it's self-explanatory when our 50 states are just a fraction of the landmass of 2 continents that bear the name. And then consider how we frame our own story. Emancipation reflects who we really are, but centuries of slavery was an aberration. The American dream is that hard work yields prosperity. So how do we account for the poverty that leaves millions of working people living hand to mouth with little hope for anything better? And if, as we say, we deeply value justice, how can we possibly tolerate our peace officers killing unarmed civilians just going about their business, in some cases inside their own homes? From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Author Mychal Denzel Smith traces our strange duality in part to our commitment to patriotism, our insistence that we live in the most favored, the most special, the most inspired and moral republic ever founded. Smith himself is uninterested in the rote expression of love for America, but he cares very deeply about the prospects of Americans. And he's here now to talk with us about the difference. Smith is a fellow at Type Media Center, and he's out with a new book called Stakes is High: Life After the American Dream. Mychal, welcome back to Think.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
So this book wrestles with the idea that many Americans have bought into a sense of beliefs about the inherent moral goodness of America, so that we shine a spotlight on positive changes as like the real us, and we just pretend the bad stuff doesn't say anything relevant about who we are.
Essentially, yeah. And I think, what I was trying to do with the book is to not just point the finger at people who do this, but own my own place in that as well. I'm not exempt from that because I am a product of, the United States of America. I was born here. My parents are from here. I'm a product of a lineage of American slavery. But what I could do as a critic of the United States was constantly say that that's a problem that other people continue to foist upon us. But I had to own my own place within it too. I did the same thing on sort of a smaller level. And looking at where I live now is New York City is a microcosm of the very thing that I'd critique to other people for doing, saying, oh, New York City will offer opportunity. New York City will do this and that for me, and I'll be able to prosper and live freely there. But it's the same city that Michael Bloomberg came in and instituted stop and frisk. It's the same city where Yusuf Hawkins was beat up and killed by a gang of white teenagers. It's the same city that gave rise to Donald Trump and his family, and a family of slumlords that were able to make millions. And I think, looking at that duality is to say that why do I choose the one story over the other? And it's because there's a belief, there's a constant optimism around America as an idea, no matter how often we fail to live up to those ideas. And it's to say, what I'm trying to get at is it's not necessarily the optimism that we can live up to those ideas that's the problem. It's the deluding ourselves that we've already done it, that choosing our history, choosing the quote unquote best of our history allows us to believe that we've already done it or we always do it. That we always rise above, that we always have in our place, we always establish our place as the special nation, as this one, as a beacon for democracy, as the greatest nation that ever lived and or that ever existed, and all of those things that we incorporate into the American narrative, and then the American identity, the things that we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's to say, once you break free of that, once you are able to be clear-eyed about this nation, then you can hear the critiques more clearly. Because I think so much of the reason why there's stalled progress, or there's little movement, or there's the resistance to these changes, is believing that once you admit to the faults of America, then that means something is wrong with you for having believed it in the first place. If you can let go of that, if you can be clear-eyed about the United States as just a country, as a country made up of people, and people who have been flawed, people who have sought power, people who have used power to enact violence and oppression and deprived people of rights and goods and services and the things that they need to survive. Once you can admit that, then we can be more clear-eyed about what needs to take place in order to correct that.
So not only do you have no interest in patriotism in the kind of traditional sense, you don't even want to interpret your dissent as a form of patriotism. How does love for America somehow interfere with loving Americans?
Well, I think what happens is when we interpret dissent, or we conceptualize the dissent as part of the American story, what happens again is that we can convince ourselves that there's something particular about the American character or the American soil or the American principles that then produce greatness in the form of dissent, right? So we will say, just a very famous example, it's like Martin Luther King Jr. is only possible in the United States because of a virtue of freedom of speech and assembly and those American principles that we hold dear. Well, he was fighting against the very fact that, Black Americans were not experiencing those rights, that they were being subjected to a different form of citizenry, a second-class citizenship. And so we like to own the greatness of King without owning the conditions that produced his greatness, as also American. And so when we fold that dissent into the American exceptionalism narrative, what we also do is to say that with this room for this expression of all of these ideas, that's what makes the greatness of our nation. Well, if we can hold both of those things, if we can hold both the repression and the dissent, then what do we actually stand for? If the principles are able, if two principles that are diametrically opposed to one another are able to stand in the exact same place, then do we stand on these ideas or not, of morality and justice and equality? Do we actually stand for those things if we make room for everything else that stands in the way of it? I think and it's a matter of then making dissent patriotic. Also, it makes it so that when we tell this story or we talk about these figures of great dissent, of activism, of resistance, we turn them into figures that then are woven into this fabric in which they become depoliticized, right? They become figures that simply stand for or stand-ins for the status quo in a way that they, during their lives, particularly those who have passed away or been killed in the name of the fight, they would have certainly been against, that they would have critiqued, that they did critique during their time. And so it's a way of, the American monoculture, a depoliticized monoculture, is able to subsume these things so that then if that's also a part of being American, then there need be no challenge to what it is to be American.
So, how did the creation of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday actually serve to help us forget the hard things that he challenged us to do?
Yeah, I think the defanging and depoliticizing of Martin Luther King started happening as soon as he was assassinated. But I think it's sort of crystallized in this moment where, and by no fault of their own, there was a number of activists and Black artists in particular, like Stevie Wonder and Gil Scott-Heron, who were fighting for getting the King holiday recognized as a national holiday. But by virtue of doing that, and by virtue of it being signed into law under Ronald Reagan as president, who in his political career stood against everything that King fought for during his life, he folds King into that story in a way in which he talks about like the greatness of American democracy, and he talks about how a democratic people overcame its challenges, and how we were able to experience the greatness of King, and all of these things, and how he would have fought for these things, and how it was a colorblind society, and all of these things that Reagan sort of defines King through. And it's to say, once you do that, once he is now part of the American fabric in such a way that doesn't say that he was questioning America or is questioning its moral validity, questioning its policies, questioning the way that Black citizens were treated, all of these, it wasn't challenging any of the structures of America. He becomes sort of like this spiritual guidance, and he becomes this, very apolitical figure that one can simply worship in a way as being an embodiment of the American ideas. And so if he lived his life questioning those ideas, and then in death is made to be a representative of those ideas, then you don't deal directly with his political philosophy, with his political ideology, with the activism, the roots of his activism, the very stinging critiques that he made of American capitalism and white supremacy and militarism. You don't deal with those things because now he's an embodiment of the very things that you project onto America that have no basis in critique.
So you know a fair number of what you call good liberal white folks, the kind of people who threatened to move to Canada in 2016 if Donald Trump won the election. I'm assuming most of them stayed put. These are people
Yeah.
who say they support Black rights but are quick to condemn Black protests or organizations or demands that strike them as too angry or too divisive. What accounts for the limitations of support you feel from these good liberal white people?
Well, it's because they're also invested in the maintenance of the status quo of the system that they have benefited from. What they are saying is, yes, I agree, this has been unjust, but there are ways of making it less unjust, right? Not making it just, not making it fair, not making it so that there are fewer police killings, but that the racial makeup of those police killings actually reflects the racial makeup of our country, right? Like there's ways in which these systems offer good white liberals protections, and they offer them monetary reward and offer them status. And they don't want to actually undo the system. What they would like is to feel like they're being good people by allowing more people to have access to, or different people to have access to the system. It's just to say that you protect the thing that gives you a sense of place and purpose in the world, and also that gives you access to housing, that is an education and healthcare, things that just provide for you. But it's to say, that system doesn't work for everyone. And the good white liberals simply say, oh, well, what if it worked for uh, a diverse group of people? Well, that's still not everyone. That's just saying, well, there's a select few that could benefit. I think it's a challenge for good white liberals to say to themselves, I'm a beneficiary of a system that is inherently unjust and needs to be transformed or abolished.
My guest is author Mychal Denzel Smith. He's a fellow at Type Media Center and author of Stakes is High: Life After the American Dream.
Funding for Think comes from TCU, where faculty do research for the greater good, like Professor Dean Williams, who uses genetic mapping to help save the horned lizard from extinction. TCU, lead on.
This is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. My guest, author Mychal Denzel Smith, is a fellow at Type Media Center and has a new book called Stakes is High: Life After the American Dream. Mychal, there are people who really don't like President Trump or what he stands for and will therefore say he and his ideas are un-American. You say, no, he is entirely and unapologetically purely American in the way he lives his life and runs the country. Talk about what you mean by that.
What I mean is that these are not new ideas. They're ideas that are in existence from the founding of this nation. What you find in Donald Trump is this, incredibly egregious and bloviating way of employing rhetoric that's inflammatory and offensive and all of that. Like, certainly. And it's not to say either that, policy wise and by virtue of what we've seen the past 4 years, that what's been enacted is not abhorrent. The recent stories of these hysterectomies being performed against the will of people being detained in immigrant detention facilities. I mean, this is absolutely disgusting. But that's not the first time that any population of people has been forced sterilized in this country, right? So, the thing about Donald Trump is that he says out loud a lot of things that have been danced around for quite some time. You can go back to sort of the implementing of the Southern strategy and Lee Atwater and Richard Nixon saying, essentially that, they want to appeal to white racists without ever actually saying out loud the racism. So they're using code language and they're switching it up in ways that don't reflect the actual bigotry that lies at the heart of their political stances. But Donald Trump says all of that stuff out loud. He says it in ways that reflect things that we think that we have eliminated from polite society. But he's so deeply American in the way in which, especially his rise, you can say from the first Black president, 8 years of Barack Obama gave direct rise to both the Tea Party movement and then Donald Trump as a backlash to the very existence of the first Black president. And I have many critiques of Barack Obama as president, as public figure, as public intellectual, but it's a notable moment of progress within the context of American history to have a Black president for 8 years in a nation that was founded on with chattel slavery of African peoples. So it's notable, but it's also notable that in response to that, the reaction was to re-entrench essentially white supremacist ideology in the form of Donald Trump. And it's no different from what happened post the end of slavery. You see Reconstruction happening, and you see the ability of Black folks to own land and to start businesses and to be voted into government and hold power. And then you see the backlash and you see the implementation of Jim Crow laws and the violence of the Ku Klux Klan and lynching and all of these, and just the destruction of various towns and the leveling of these cities in which Black folks held power. you can see it at the end of what we note as like the civil rights movement. You see the advancement of civil rights, you see the end of legal segregation, and then you see the backlash in the form of Richard Nixon's law and order stances, and Ronald Reagan and welfare queens, and the war on drugs, and the dismantling of the public sphere. I mean, you see it in, new voter suppression laws. I mean, all of these things are natural backlashes to a country, in a country whereby, especially like rich white men, believe that this land and this country are their birthright. And so when swings happen in ways that reflect any diminishing of that status, they swing back. And Donald Trump was that swing. He represents the things that have always been embedded in this country, and there's no escaping that, right? It's like I was saying earlier. It's like you can't own the progress without owning what the thing that the progress was there to fight against.
So there are people who dislike President Trump as much as you do and will therefore refer to him as like not my president.
Mm-hmm.
This bothers you because it implies that like if they didn't vote for him, they have nothing to do with the conditions that allowed for his election.
Yeah, and as if it matters that he's not your president in particular. He's still the president. And that personal stake and that personal ownership of the presidency doesn't reflect anything. It doesn't reflect any political stance. It doesn't reflect any, like, it reflects your own sense of more like righteousness, and that you can take this sort of moral stand. But yes, if you believe simply that the extent of your political duties and your political commitment is the voting of a president, then you've missed the whole thing. The president, for so much, we've handed over a lot of power to the office of the president, and it's very undemocratic in my estimation to hand over so much power, but also like the cultural capital of the idea of the president and the singular figure. But if that's it, if that's all you think you need to do, then you're missing what happens with the collective, and like the way that collective movement, collective organizing is the actual vehicle for change. A presidency reflects different moods in the nation, but it's all confined has been all confined within a very narrow corridor of what politics could be represented. And so shifting from president to president, it's meaningful. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm saying like, oh, Democrats and Republicans are exactly the same. They are not. But the level of shift from one to the other isn't the dramatic change that we would like for it to, or that some people would like for it to be. And so if you are not participating in things that have to do with activism, the things that have to do with actual organizing of people and petitioning, getting things on local ballots, organizing people around consciousness raising and ideas that exist outside of the mainstream of American politics, then what you're doing is you're allowing the politics to be dictated to you, as rather than being an active participant in it. And the presidency is only an outgrowth of where we are politically at any given moment. How do you push to make sure that those politics are where we need them to be?
Art, you mentioned that you moved to New York a few years ago. Specifically, you live in Brooklyn, and you say your neighborhood is the hood because there's a lot of trash around. People in other neighborhoods might assume that folks in your area care less about where they live than people in wealthier neighborhoods. You looked around and realized it comes down to something much simpler than that.
Yeah, we don't have any trash cans. We don't have any public trash cans. And in the book, what I'm writing about is like I go to therapy on the very wealthy Upper East Side in Manhattan, and on the walk from the train station to my therapist's office, I saw a trash can on every single corner. And now it's every single corner. And like I look in my neighborhood and I can walk several blocks without seeing a trash can. It's not really a difference in terms of like, population size, there's like few more people that are living in the Upper East Side than my neighborhood, but not a dramatic difference in terms of like what public services would need, especially for a place that's as busy as the street that I live, that I'm talking about. And so if there's that difference, what it means is that it's a difference in public investment, right? It's to say this neighborhood and these people deserve this type of public money to be able to provide for their needs. And so you get them a bunch of trash cans and then you pay people to come and collect that trash regularly. That's not what happens in my neighborhood. And so what I want to point to is just like, if that's the difference and you can observe this, how do we keep placing the blame on the people who are subjected to that public indifference, subjected to that public divestment from their neighborhoods for the conditions of their neighborhoods, and then like chastise and admonish them that they need to be more responsible for their neighborhood and cleaning it up? There's not a difference in the way in which they treat their neighborhood. It's the difference in what's available to them.
You write a lot of things in this book that will stick with me, but this is maybe the primary thing. You write, it matters what you see as the problems in need of solving: blackness or anti-blackness, poverty or the poor. What happens when we declare whole categories of people as problems that need solving?
Well, in this country, what happens is we send the police after them, and that's a huge problem. But even when it's not we don't turn it into a criminal matter, which we just very often do. What happens is you blame then people where systems are responsible. So if poverty is the problem, then you look at the things that create poverty, right? Like you look at the ways in which poverty is situated within a system of capitalism that requires an exploitable class that sells its labor at less than its value so that other people can then benefit from that labor. A small class of people can benefit from that labor and be wealthy by virtue of ownership as opposed to labor. If that's your analysis, because poverty is the problem, then you're changing the system in a different way. If you look at poor people as a problem, then you're trying to assign to poor people a status of less moral character, right? Like their poverty, their status as poor people is reflective of their unwillingness to work hard, unwillingness to participate in the system, to adhere to social mores, to get to dress up the way that you need to for a job interview or what have you. I mean, all of these things, yes, they could help in little ways, but like, does existing in poverty also then translate to? It also translates to your access to healthy food and clean water, and the way that schools are funded, it affects your access to quality education, and so you're already set back. What we then say, if poor people are the problem, it's that they have to work harder and they have to be more resourceful to overcome the system, as opposed to saying that the system is itself the problem, that poverty is created by virtue of the way that we've organized our economy. So what we do then is we just diminish the humanity of the people who are experiencing or on the other side of a dehumanizing system, that are on the other side of an oppressive system, and tell them that it's their fault.
This is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. So what has kept poor Black people and poor white people from uniting to fight for better conditions, which is not to say it's entirely their responsibility, to your point a moment ago, but from seeing themselves, as, why do they not see themselves as allies, but instead competitors in a zero-sum game?
Yeah, it's in part what W.B. Du Bois sort of describes, and I'm paraphrasing, but as the like psychic wages of whiteness, in that, you know, what poor white people are still banking on is the idea that whiteness will pay off for them, and that in a nation that is organized around white supremacy, they will have more access, and that whiteness does bequeath upon them certain privileges that that blackness will never, and that they are wanting and hoping they'll be able to take advantage of at some point. And it's also to say that by virtue of blackness being at the bottom of that socioeconomic status, it's to say that there's a separation because you don't want to believe yourself to be a part of the bottom. You don't want to believe yourself to be a part of a class of exploited people. That to prove yourself worthy, you must participate in the subjugation of Black people. I mean, that's the way in which immigrant communities that come from European countries that initially are treated as they are, as white ethnics that were separate from whiteness in their initial forays into this country. The Irish, the Italians, then get adopted into whiteness by virtue of their willingness to participate in the subjugation of Black people. Like you can look at like political cartoons from sort of turn of the century, 19th to 20th. All the police officers are Irish, and that's because there was a heavy Irish influence or a heavy Irish population within policing, because what they were enlisted to do were to be police officers that then policed Black ghettos and were responsible for the violence that Black people experience in inner cities. And they then get conferred upon them the rights and privileges of whiteness. It's to say, that, but what they were experiencing previously was exactly the same thing that Black folk were experiencing in those inner cities. They were experiencing high levels of poverty, lack of education, lack of clean water, all of those things. But someone invested in them, and someone said that that the way to prosperity is not through violence. It's not through criminalizing them. It's through education, and it's through all of these social programs. And so there just become these clear markers that for poor whites, that I am different from these poor Black people. I don't have in common the same things. I don't have in common the struggle that poor Black people are going through. And it's a means of ensuring that a ruling class divides those working and poor people so that they are never seeing those commonalities and organizing for the collective uprising.
My guest is author Mychal Denzel Smith, a fellow at Type Media Center and author of the new book, Stakes is High: Life After the American Dream. This is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. My guest this hour is author and Type Media Center fellow Mychal Denzel Smith. His new book is called Stakes is High: Life After the American Dream. All right, Mychal, you're aware of this. There are people who are fed up with identity politics, characterize them as somehow self-centered and dismissive of the suffering of any group that we don't belong to. You note that a demand for something like the freedom of Black women comes with a much broader set of implied benefits for everyone. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, identity politics. I mean, all of these lots of things make it to sort of popular publications and mainstream acceptance and become completely divorced from their original meanings. And so I think of looking back and saying, what is this actually supposed to encapsulate? And the Combahee River Collective, which is a collective of Black queer women scholars and activists and writers who came together to theorize for Black women's liberation. And what they were saying with identity politics is that they believed that if you were to address the political concerns and needs of Black queer women across the globe, then you would, by necessity, then dismantle all the systems of oppression, because Black queer women, particularly Black poor queer women sat at the nexus of all of those oppressive systems. And they termed this identity politics because they were looking at their own identity as Black women specifically to assess what was necessary to organize around. But then the term just sort of proliferates and people adopt it and keep using it just to simply mean a politics born of one's own identity, and even if that were to be the broadest definition that you could apply, I think still what identity politics in its original conception asks us to do is to situate that identity within the context of what systems of oppression am I experiencing, and then what to organize around. And so it becomes this diluted thing in that we're just talking about, the identity politics of being a white man or the identity politics of being a Black trans person. But really what it is it's a new, or was a new organizing principle to be able to say that the way in which we organize for liberation must center those who sit at all of these different forms of oppression. And if you do look at the oppression of poor, queer, Black women, then you are looking at forms of oppression that constitute capitalism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. And you're saying all of those things must fall to liberate this group of people, which will ultimately liberate all of us.
I want to pivot here. You have looked closely at The Cosby Show, which was this national sensation a couple of years before you were born. It had Black fans, it had white fans. What about the show provided absolution for white viewers?
Well, it's a part of a myth making, and it's a part of American myth making that Bill Cosby was participating in a particular, through a particular Black lens, and that what he was trying to do was to eliminate the issue of race altogether from the experience of the Huxtables. It was to say, no, you can enjoy us too. We can provide entertainment, and we don't have to be the stereotypes that you've understood. We are human, and our experiences on film, on television, can encapsulate that. And we exist on all spectrums of economic status, and we're just like you. We have the same problems. We confront the same things with raising our children and being married and all of these things. And it's to take away any of the particularities of a Black experience in favor of a raceless, the idea of a raceless experience, which then for white viewers was this absolution to say, I don't need to concern myself with race if this very funny, very affable, charming family doesn't think about the question of race at all. They've done what what America said was possible. If you work hard, if you get an education, you can overcome anything. And so therefore you're welcomed into their home to be able to live along with that sense of the American dream being accomplished with them, and never interrogate the obstacles that they then faced, or that folks who look like them, that in that Brooklyn neighborhood that they're supposed to be a part of, would probably also be facing, especially in 1980s New York. It's such a weird sense of 1980s New York, in which there is basically no violence whatsoever in the world of The Cosby Show. There's no poverty. There's no sense that there's anything wrong with the world. It's a fantasy. And then it's not to say yes, television, you can construct a fantasy world if you want, but what does it say about the national popularity of that fantasy during a time of particular of turmoil in Black communities?
So as to the present day Bill Cosby, the one who's in prison for rape, you emphatically do not defend him, but you also say we are far too quick to assume that a society that has allowed scores of famous men, probably thousands of less influential ones, to commit acts of sexual violence is somehow not something we all contribute to, even if we've never hurt anybody. How would a collective accountability for violence change the way we deal with individual offenders?
Well, it's to say that what we're looking for is accountability, I believe, but in looking for justice, and that's the big word is justice. We're looking for there to be some sense that you have wronged someone, and therefore there needs to be retribution. There needs to be something on the other end of that. But what my question is, how do we believe then that some type of punishment for that individual will produce justice or will be fair in any way when it is a societal problem that we have conditioned particularly cisgender hetero men to believe that they have the rights to other people's bodies, that they have access to whenever they want other people's bodies, that autonomy does not apply to anyone other than themselves, and that when they are denied or just have the desire, they can take other people's bodies and violate them through violence, through force. If we say that collectively and we think that we're not saying it because we say rape is wrong, right? We say no means no, but in every other aspect of our culture and in our politics, who gets rewarded? We have indeed sitting in the office of president someone who's been accused of sexual assault and rape a number of times. You have two sitting Supreme Court justices accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault. You have scores of other elected officials who've been caught. You have people within the entertainment industry, within journalism, within every aspect of our lives, within the church, who have been accused or outright convicted of, or it is just known that they have abused people. How does convicting that one person then change anything? What does it mean to be for that one person to be accountable? It means that we are all accountable for the ways in which we have contributed to those to the idea that some people have less right to their body, particularly cisgender hetero men have a right to sexual domination, and that if we change the social mores, if we change again the structures, then we are producing less of that as an ideology. We produce less of it as behavior. And then in the instances where those individual acts may still occur, we can look at the factors that contribute to that and help then to get people who are offenders, perpetrators of such heinous violence, to understand their actions in the context of the way that we understand it, born out of senses of toxic masculinity and ideas of power and coercion and domination, and those being means of respect or social status and what have you. Once we can do that, when we can shift that thinking in that ways, in the ways in which we think about like what it means to be accountable, then we're talking about the reduction of the violence altogether.
This is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. You've spent some time imagining what America might look like today if Shirley Chisholm had won the presidency in 1972, but you also realize the kind of country that would have elected a Shirley Chisholm would not need a Shirley Chisholm to be president. This is a frustrating conundrum, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one thing during the course of writing the book, Shirley Chisholm came up a lot for me. Because I was wearing a Shirley Chisholm sweatshirt on the night of election 2016, and as the results were coming in, and the realization that Donald Trump was going to win. It was just kind of a daydreaming thing where it's just like, what would happen? What would we be if Shirley Chisholm had won when she ran? But it's like you just point out, like, there was no way that Shirley Chisholm could have won in 1972. We would have to be a completely different country for her to have won. For a black woman born in Brooklyn to immigrant parents who was a school teacher and then political organizer and then a state assemblywoman, and whose very first speech when she was elected the first Black woman to the United States Congress was to stand on the House floor and denounce the Vietnam War and American militarism more broadly. We'd have to be a very different country to believe that that person would have a shot at becoming president. And I also just resent the idea that she would need to be president in the first place to have an effect. I mean, what she fought for throughout her career, throughout the rest of her life after her congressional career, was the rights of poor people, was making sure that poor people had the things that they needed to survive, to fighting for children, writing for the expansion of the food stamp program. These are things that she believed in and that she fought for diligently. She fought for reproductive rights and the right to an abortion. That was part of her platform. All of these things that are still contested today. So if she had won in 1972, I'd like to think that would have signaled that we were a very different nation, ready for a very different kind of politics. But the fact that she couldn't even muster 2% of the Democratic Party vote means that we weren't prepared, and we still aren't prepared. We still are existing in this very narrow conception of what's acceptable politics.
Do you have any reason to believe a Biden-Harris presidency would change your life very much?
No. I mean, I think the what we're looking at is Donald Trump has to go. There's just no question about that. He must be removed from office. We have to, the option on the table is the Biden-Harris ticket. But unless people are willing to stand right now and demand radical things from them, then no, it doesn't change that much, because the very structures that made it possible for Donald Trump's rise in the first place are still in place. But the book is called Stakes is High because stakes have never been higher than what they are right now. You see the wildfires raging across the west coast of this country. You see the hurricanes gathering in the Gulf Coast. We are in the midst still of a global pandemic of this airborne illness. What about any of that gets rectified immediately with a Biden-Harris presidency? I like to think about the way in which Biden likes to talk about, is told over and over again, this story of standing up to Slobodan Milosevic and calling him a war criminal to his face. And I'm like, well, is he willing to do that to the heads of the 100 corporations that are responsible for 71% of carbon emissions and dooming us to an existence on this earth that may be uninhabitable? Unless he's willing to take those kinds of stances, then no, I don't have much hope for things getting significantly better, but I think, it's still necessary. It's a first step.
Mychal Denzel Smith is a fellow at Type Media Center and author of Stakes is High, Life After the American Dream. Mychal, thank you so much for making time to speak with us again.
No, thank you for having me.
You can listen to the podcast on our website, think.kera.org. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.